Hi there, I'm Diane Callahan, fiction editor, YouTuber, arts marketer, and writer of all the things. I ask for your questions about world building. This mostly applies to fantasy or science fiction, but I feel like it also applies to made up settings in a contemporary or historical context. And as a companion piece to this episode, I created a video on the fundamentals of world building, and specifically how to integrate the character's journey into that world. So definitely go give that a watch or a listen as well. Here we go. Question 1. How can you establish backstory of the world/political elements early on without info dumping? This is absolutely the number one question when it comes to world building. Info dumping, for those who are unfamiliar with that term, is when you deliver this huge chunk of information to the reader. You're spending a full page explaining why the city was built on a mountain or any other background information. And it's a really blatant description of how things work in this world, specifically something that the author wants the reader to know so they can understand the context for the plot and the characters. This is also known as exposition, and that's a much more neutral term, while info dumping is a more negative label, especially if readers feel like the story has come to a halt so the author can deliver this world building lecture. That usually takes the form of these long paragraphs and super on the nose dialogue, that kind of thing. Now, exposition and info dumping aren't inherently bad at all. They're narratively necessary, just like telling is with showing. And I also think readers have different tolerance levels for info dumping. So I don't think it's always something authors need to avoid. Victor Hugo certainly didn't care about going on these lengthy digressions about the French sewer system in Les Mis, since he felt the history of men is reflected in the history of sewers. All that being said, if you want to be subtle about your world building, there are 5 tricks or methods that I really like to use, and they include narrative voice, action, change, dialogue with a few caveats there, and withholding information. Naturally, I've got examples for each. So, with narrative voice, you can convey the background information in a way that's poetic or funny or visually interesting in some way. So, what do I mean by narrative voice? So, to me, narrative voice entails some type of strong emotion coming through. Terry Pratchett is amazing at this. For example, his book Night Watch, which is part of the Discworld series, has this Assassin's Guild, and he explains how the guild works through humor and the character's inner monologue. And there's a part in the first chapter that goes like this. He sighed. He really wanted to discourage this sort of thing, but they'd put him off the register. It wasn't that he'd liked being shot at by hooded figures in the temporary employ of his many and varied enemies, but he'd always looked at it as some kind of vote of confidence. It showed that he was annoying the rich and arrogant people who ought to be annoyed. We learn a lot of context from this little snippet about the guild, and the essence of it is he had many rich and powerful enemies who wanted him dead, but it's said in this more engaging way and conveyed through the character's voice. A second way to avoid info dumping is action. Show don't tell, essentially. How can the character externally encounter and react to a world building element rather than just thinking about it internally? I'm never gonna stop talking about the novel A Memory Called Empire because I just really love that book, especially the world building. Some of the terms are defined in this world, but some aren't. In either case, it's all part of the action. There's no stopping the forward momentum of the story. Instead, it's just a brief pause rather than bringing things to a halt to explain it. Take this sentence from the first page. Mahit came down to the city, heart planet and capital of the Takes-Kalani Empire, in a seed skiff, a bubble of a ship hardly big enough for her body and her luggage both. So here we get the definition of a seed skiff as a bubble of a ship that's hardly big enough for her body. And that description is paired with action and how the character is physically interacting with this world-building element. The author could have said something like, a seed skiff, a small ship for transporting passengers, but the description is instead tied to the character rather than generalized. It's part of the scene rather than separate from it. And a third way to incorporate backstory is to have the character notice a change in how the world usually operates. And in my world building video, I talk about how breaking a rule of your world gives you an excuse to describe that rule. Say that you have a protagonist who believes that everyone loves and respects the kingdom's ruler, but then they encounter a statue of that beloved leader that has been recently defaced. This gives the protagonist an excuse to share who the statue is, what they represent, and why people are now defacing it. They might choose to clean off the statue, but someone else is mad at them for doing so. It's a way to show the current political climate in that world through the scene and characters. And so, violating the norm gives you an excuse to explain the norm through conflict. A fourth really common way to provide exposition is dialogue, but this can go wrong pretty quickly. Infodumping in dialogue can work when you have a character who's new to the world, like in the Percy Jackson series, where Percy learns about demigods alongside the readers. Now, the main character could be the outsider like Percy, or they are the expert, explaining the world to an outsider. And this is what I tried to do when I was plotting Wish Hunter, which is an urban fantasy novel published through Storygarden. And the protagonist has been in the wishing world for years. And then she comes across this total noob, and she takes advantage of his lack of knowledge to con him out of a wish. And later, when they team up, she explains to him what he did wrong. And that also serves as a way to provide that world-building rule to the reader. Expository dialogue can come across as transparently delivering information, though. It's really important to avoid monologues and have it be a back-and-forth exchange with some tension. Maybe they have difficulty getting information out of the other person, or one person has an agenda and how they're conveying the information. Now, this last technique is one I'd really like to master, which is withholding information, turning the world building into mystery and intrigue. Instead of explaining things right away, you create questions and curiosities in the reader's mind, then elaborate later. I finally read The Golem and the Genie recently. It's been on my to-read list forever, and it's a fantasy novel set in New York City in 1899. The type of magic that's possible comes through in how the author describes the characters, including the man who creates the golem. This is how he's introduced. Stories abounded about Shalman, all slightly different. That he was the disgraced rabbi who'd been driven out of his congregation, that he'd been possessed by a Dybbuk and given supernatural powers, and even that he was over 100 years old and slept with demon women. But all the stories agreed on this. Shalman liked to dabble in the more dangerous of the Kabbalistic arts, and he was willing to offer his services for a price. Barren women had visited him in the dead of night, and conceived soon after. Peasant girls in search of men's affections bought Shalman's bags of powders, and then stirred them into their beloved spear. We don't yet know which story about him is true, and the author isn't stopping to explain what his powers can and can't do. The narrative voice and the visuals of what the magic looks like keep me immersed in the story. I know I basically wrote a video script with that answer, but I think infodumping is the biggest struggle when it comes to world building. Question 2. Is there a way to world build without just unintentionally copying someone else? I constantly get frustrated with this because every time I have a good idea, it's just too similar to something else. Does that go away once you actually start writing, or is it just harder to world build nowadays? There's this great video series called Everything is a Remix that talks about how everything from songs to movies to inventions are remixes of what's come before. So even Lord of the Rings is essentially Beowulf fanfiction, with Tolkien borrowing characters from the epic poem. I would say it's not that there are fewer ideas, because even stories we think are original are actually derived from something else. To me, originality in world building isn't about coming up with something nobody has ever heard of. It's more about combining elements in an interesting way that subverts expectations. Project Hail Mary, for example, by Andy Weir, was a mega bestseller. It's a near-future sci-fi novel where a schoolteacher wakes up in a spacecraft with no idea how he got there. The story is playing with a lot of familiar tropes. It's a first contact story, it's a buddy cop comedy, there's an incoming apocalypse plus a character trapped in space. But there are two world-building aspects attached to those tropes that freshen them up, particularly the astrophage, which are causing the central problem in this novel. And I don't want to spoil it too much, but it is an original dilemma in my mind. It comes down to the fact that a lot of the story's parts aren't new, but it's those new combinations that make it interesting. Changing the setting, the main character, the plot dilemma. Also, people love seeing certain tropes, so sometimes I think we're a little too averse to familiar ideas when people actually want to read those. Elemental magic has been around forever. So, Avatar The Last Airbender is a popular example, along with Tamora Pierce's Circle of Magic series. And just because a lot of stories use elemental magic doesn't mean nobody wants to read more of it. There are always new readers in the world, plus readers who are nostalgic for old favorites and want to revisit those tropes in a slightly new way. I would think about your world's most memorable feature, its distinctive element. What is the aspect readers will think of when they look back at your story? What's your version of the astrophage from Project Hail Mary? I think one way to come up with a memorable world building feature is to practice taking a familiar trope and changing one aspect of it. So, say you've got a Ring of Power, classic. What if you turned it into a Ring of Powerless, where it takes away power and is nearly impossible to remove? Or what if instead of unicorns that are attracted to the pure of heart, you have these dark unicorns that only grant the wishes of murderers? Then you have people murdering others so they can get that powerful wish. So my advice is don't shy away from the familiar. Steal like an artist. As Austin Kleon says, everything that needs to be said has already been said. But since no one was listening, everything must be said again. Question 3. How to best portray cultures without making them seem entirely isolated and distinct from another. How to demonstrate culture through your characters, including different facets of that same culture, or the subculture they belong to. Ah yes, the Planet of Hats problem. I'm pulling out my TV tropes definition again. Planet of Hats is when everyone in a culture has a defining characteristic, like wearing hats. So this results in a monoculture that doesn't feel very realistic, given how all cultures have subcultures and contradictions. Like for people from the United States, if you said something like, Americans love football and apple pie, I would feel very excluded because I'm not a huge fan of either of those things. I'm into pickleball and lemon meringue pie. But the stereotype of football and apple pie is perhaps true in a general way. Some surveys show that the majority of Americans say football, as in American football, not our version of soccer, is their favorite sport. But does half of the country truly represent American culture? That's the question of the age. A big part of this comes from the limitations of storytelling. It becomes harder to differentiate cultures when they don't have a defining quality of some kind. Nuance is difficult in that large-scale world building. And as the author, you can't include everything, and the reader isn't going to remember everything either. So I feel like having more than one character who represents the culture, such as 3 people who have similarities on a much broader level but belong to different subcultures, is a way to demonstrate that nuance. They can have one big aspect in common, such as language or the type of houses they live in, but they might have different religious beliefs. I think this is also a situation where well-voiced exposition could work, where you have a passage that shows how much people in that culture can differ without having to show them all in a scene. It could be as simple as summarizing your protagonist visiting 12 different bakeries, and he internally notes the subtle differences between them. They all serve his favorite sweetbread that's unique to that culture, but some of the clerks refuse to talk to him in their native tongue. Others are friendly and give him extra for being a foreigner. Some of them make the sweetbread spicy. The character and the reader aren't basing their entire opinion of the culture based on one interaction. But we do realize that sweetbread is a culturally defining feature. I asked some fellow writers for recommendations for books that avoid monocultures, and they recommended Ian M. Banks' culture novels, the Baru Cormorant books by Seth Dickinson, the Expanse series by James S. A. Corey, and Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. There were also some comments about basing fantasy worlds off of real places. Sam Wallace said it best, the more specific you are, the more you need to respect it. The more generic you are, the less there is to respect. If you're basing your cultures off of real-world people, the nuances are even more important there because having an antagonist from a certain background might be interpreted as a bad stereotype. I remember seeing that Veronica Roth had this problem with her science fantasy novel Carve the Mark, where she has the Thuve and the Shotet as different races. The Thuve are lighter skinned and more passive, whereas the Shotet are described as violent and brutal, with a harsher sounding language. The cultures don't have exact parallels to any real culture, But even in a fantasy setting, readers bring in their knowledge of real world dynamics. So, to prevent that problem, I would have your critique partners or beta readers give you feedback with that cultural aspect in mind. Ask them how they would describe the cultures you've created, and that will tell you if the cultures feel distinct without being too homogenized. Question 4. World building seems so overwhelming at times. Where do you even start? And how do I know how much is too much? When is it enough? I actually combined two question askers there, and my answer to both relates to character. Personally, I usually start with concepts first. Something like, what if we lived in a dystopia with sleep substitution pills that made it so we could work 100-hour work weeks? But from that concept, I know that I immediately need to connect it to a character. In this case, I'm imagining an ambitious office worker who's looking to climb that corporate ladder, and he is contrasted with his friend who doesn't want to take the pills and therefore ends up falling behind at work. And I only recently discovered that this is basically the plot of the 1993 novel Beggars in Spain by Nancy Kress. So again, no idea is original. You can start world building with the ideas that excite you the most. What topics make you curious in the real world? How can you build those into your fictional one? There are plenty of world building templates out there for building out the geography, technology, food, language, clothing, and so on. And I always recommend creating a world building Bible that you can update as you write. Keeping good notes for yourself is a way to avoid feeling overwhelmed. You can even get feedback on your world from people who write in your genre. r/worldbuilding on Reddit is a good place to talk through those thoughts. You can go to reddit.com/r/worldbuilding, one word. And here's how you can tell you're too deep into the world building weeds. When you know more about the world than you do your characters. You can absolutely start with the world, but you should know as much about your characters as you do the world, which is hard to do sometimes, admittedly. And if you're spending months world building and no time writing, then remember to put the focus back on your characters and their journeys, both externally and internally. Don't lose the plot or the emotional arc. At the end of the day, a good story is about the characters. Emotional connection to the world comes in part from the people who populate it. Asimov's Foundation series is very idea-heavy as a sci-fi world, but even so, it opens with character. His name was Gal Dornick, and he was just a country boy who had never seen Trantor before. That is, not in real life. He had seen it many times on the hypervideo, and occasionally in tremendous three-dimensional newscasts covering the imperial coronation or the opening of a galactic council. Even though he had lived all his life on the world of Synax, which circled a star at the edges of the Blue Drift, he was not cut off from civilization, you see. At that time, no place in the galaxy was. So, start with character. What aspects of the world are most relevant to them and to their journey? How can you filter those details through their understanding of geography, history, politics? If you just like world building for world building's sake, there's no problem with that. You might not have an audience in a traditional publishing sense, but it's like playing D&D, writing for the SCP Foundation. You do it for the thrill of it, not for the end product, whether you're building a world on your own or with other people. And as I said before, different readers have different tolerance levels in terms of how much world building they want to see. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, I can't pronounce that, Silmarillion? Silmarillion. I mean, Tolkien's Silmarillion is dense and complex, more lore than narrative. As one of my friends put it, it's not so much a book to read cover to cover as a polished holistic story, but rather a lot of disparate and incomplete pieces of the puzzle of Tolkien's mind and vision for Middle-earth. Other forms of fantastical fiction have much lighter world building, where the point isn't to plan out every detail, but rather to explore the effect of one magical feature, which is similar to my concept of curio fiction, which you can watch an entire video on that or read the article on Medium. And an example of curio fiction is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno Garcia, where the characters have these telekinetic powers, but those are less important than their relationships. The best way to explore your world is to write it, to let your characters experience what you've created firsthand. For me, the most fascinating world-building details often spontaneously generate through the act of writing, rather than just brainstorming. I'll leave you with this piece of setting from a literary novel that has some touches of fabulism, The Summer That Melted Everything by Tiffany McDaniel. I once heard someone refer to breathed as the scar of the paradise we lost. So it was in many ways, a place with a perfect wound just below the surface. It was a resting in the southern low of Ohio, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, where each porch had an orchard of small talk and rocking chairs, where cigarette tongues flapped over glasses of lemonade. Those small details are what make a world feel alive. You can find the full transcript of this episode on Medium, and I collect questions for my upcoming podcast on my YouTube community page. I'm happy to share that I've had 2 poems accepted for publication since my last podcast, one in the anthology Common Threads, and another forthcoming in the Emerson Review. My debut poetry collection, The Ship in the Storm, will be released in September 2025. Feel free to check out my videos, articles, and publications on my website at quotidianwriter.com. If you want to support this podcast, feel free to buy me a coffee on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/quotidianwriter. Whatever you do, keep writing.